Hello. Welcome. Thank you. So, we are going to be continuing coverage of a series of essays put together by Kaepernick Publishing on the subject of police abolition. Right. Now, for people who have never been inside the prison system, it's very easy to kind of delude ourselves into whatever we want to believe that it actually does. This particular one, there have been a number of these from people who either are or have been in prison. This is written from someone who was arrested at the age of 19, served many years in prison, has gotten out, but who articulates that nothing about his time in prison actually helped him. This is Marlon Peterson. He was in the news in the New York Times some time ago. He elaborates on that, but it gets at the heart of the question, though, of what is the purpose of prisons and what do they actually do? So, who is being healed? Creating Solutions is about answering questions prisons never asked. I was 19 when I went to prison, but prison isn't what healed me. By Marlon Peterson. The first and only time my name was mentioned in the New York Times was in connection with the 2001 headline, "Man Found Guilty in Killings at Muffin Shop in Manhattan." My name was buried in the 6th paragraph. The headline was meant for my co-defendant, but I was the 19-year-old villainous co-star in a cast of crooks who were hoping there was some savior like Viola Davis's Anna Keating who could help us get away with felony murder. The same year of this headline, Critical Resistance, an organization founded on the politics of abolition, held its second conference in Manhattan. Critical Resistance was all about abolishing the prison industrial complex, back when only super-leftists understood the word abolition in a context other than its association with Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, and Sojourner Truth. I wonder what some of the founders of the organization, notables like Angela Davis, Rose Braz, and Ruth Wilson Gilmore, thought about those of us in the New York Times article. My co-defendants and I are case studies that skeptics of abolition parade out as examples of the impracticality of abolition. So, this is actually a really important framing. This was some of the cases that we've talked about were, people who were, like, say, defending themselves from police. This is an individual who right out of the gate just says, yeah, I'm guilty of felony murder. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. It was not self-defense. It was felony murder. And he's right. This is the type of case that people will bring up to say, well, you can't abolish police or prisons. There's murderers out there. So let's see what his thought process is. If you abolish police and prisons, what are you going to do about people like Marlon Peterson? What does accountability look like for him? Are you suggesting that he remain in the community and possibly felony murder more people? Referring to myself in the third person isn't my narcissism taking the wheel. It is me, a self-proclaimed abolitionist, asking aloud the questions I ask myself every time I attend a shooting response for a murdered baby, when I hear about a violent weekend in Chicago, and yes, even when I chant in the streets that I want the killers of Breonna Taylor to be arrested. Abolition is more than a politic evincing an end of prisons and police. Abolition is an action word. It is a daily practice, just like meditation, yoga, veganism. Abolition is questioning ourselves first, why we believe that prison is the only form of justice, outside of the Old Testament axiom of an eye for an eye, for people who live in the headlines like I once did. Who taught you that prison was justice for any human? Where did you learn that police equates to public safety? From where did you first hear that vengeance is what healing and accountability looks like in public? Now, these are all very much taught behaviors and taught learned thought practices. These concepts are things that were constructed by society and are perpetuated by society. It's just kind of accepted as normal. But they are systems that we have devised and continue to perpetuate. It takes a particular imagination and a willingness to say, is this the best we can do? It seems like an easy question, like on the surface, like, yeah, things can always be improved, but most people aren't willing to go there. Most people aren't willing to engage with the concept. I have to admit, I was always rooting for Keating to win her cases. Yeah. Prisons and police did not always exist. The first American brick-and-mortar prison, the Walnut Street Prison, is 6 months older than the Declaration of Independence. The first modern police force was organized in Boston only in 1838. Slave patrols in the South predated this northern innovation of police reform, and guess who had no voice in the establishment of either? Black people, brown people, indigenous people, and poor whites. And women, as Orphinia mentions. That's true. Rich white men dreamt of the idea of an armed group of white men who would protect the property of landowners catching runaway slaves. In the spirit of reform, liberal whites, who were also champions of the abolition of slavery, conjured prisons as a form of penance for unhappy creatures, as the Philadelphia Society for Alleviating the Miseries of Public Prisons described them. The idea of America coincided with the creation of incarceration. So yeah, what he's touching on is that this is very rimworldy. Did I not change the category, or are you just touching on that because I play Rimworld? It is very Rimworldy. But what he's touching on is an important point, that these institutions are, first of all, rather new, and second of all, were only built from the imaginations of and input of rich white men. From a foundational perspective, they were designed to do a particular thing, and they do that thing very, very well, which is the aforementioned protect the property of landowners and, yeah, even today, catch runaway slaves. We just don't use that term anymore, but they do technically still fill these cages with black men. As kind of an aside, it was only in 1995 even, the then governor of Florida re-implemented chain gangs here, modeling them after something he saw in Alabama, where prisoners who were forced to do manual labor, I don't know how you can call that anything but slavery, would be chained together by leg shackles and chains. So these are not like distant past ancient foundations of human society. These are new innovations that are young, that are still quite young, and warrant criticism, and warrant considering, is this the best we can do? Can we build a better system? Those are really important questions to be able to ask. It's really hard to take that first step. Everyone has that cop in their voice that's just been beaten into us from media, from our upbringing, from, interacting with society in general. This is just kind of a normalization of the system that we live in, but it's not the only thing that can exist. Anyway. In this historical moment of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Tony McDade, and others becoming involuntary martyrs of this racial revolution, we must also reconsider the conditioned belief that police and prisons are a panacea for the unhappiness demonstrated through everyday violence exhibited in the streets of places like Jackson, Mississippi, Englewood, Chicago, and Los Angeles, Indian Country, and Appalachia. Cages and cops for black and brown people were imagined without our input before it became our policy. At some point, we were persuaded that some of us were innately bad and required police and prison to correct us. White male landowners taught us that the most marginalized residents of the United States were bad, while conveniently omitting the flaws of the American idea that democracy can thrive with a few determining what is best for all, that the unhappiness of the poor and black can be solved by their confinement. Modern abolition requires that we ask a different, better, more difficult, and more unpopular questions. Does incarceration make the community safer? I'm going to pause on these because they are very important questions. For that first one thing that we can point to is the fact that despite us having record numbers of people in prison, we continue to have crime. In fact, it hasn't meaningfully fluctuated much in any direction as a result of increasing prisons. There are correlations that can be pointed to. There are causations that can be pointed to. When a community receives significant investment, when there's better economic opportunity pushed into a neighborhood, that you can draw a very clear line between that and a reduction of crime in that area. Kind of feels like the threats aren't working. Right. And a lot of that is you have to, focus the question, which is what is driving people to crime? Usually it's desperation. Very often, desperation driven by such abject poverty that it is the only route to survival. And not always, mind you, but very frequently. And if the answer is death by starvation and destitution, or roll the dice on getting imprisoned, you're gonna roll the dice on getting imprisoned. It doesn't matter how harsh, prison looks. People don't want to starve. They will do what they have to survive. So, we can do a discussion on this sometime, just to really put to the screws this question of, does incarceration make the community safer? I would posit it does not. Simply because of those statistics, that crime has not changed no matter how many people we put in a cage. Second question. Will a prison cell address the hurt, loss, and sense of insecurity felt by the real victims of the headline, the people harmed by Marlon and his co-defendants? Let's see. Blazelord says there's the argument when someone says people aren't starving to death. Right. And, that is, there are cases where people aren't, that they just choose to for other factors. But to touch on it, incarceration itself is not prescriptive. It is ineffective at actually making a community safer. Right. Yeah, because the guy who nearly starved to death has been arrested for stealing bread, right? Yeah. So the second question is an interesting one. So let's, say that you have had a family member killed by another individual. And this is the question. Does putting the person who did that in a cage for decades actually, does it meaningfully address the hurt and loss? I've not been on the receiving end of this. I don't know that I could, provide a meaningful answer. But it is an important question. There are various surveys out there. There are some people who do feel that, or who espouse that they do feel vindicated if the person who wronged them is imprisoned. There are some who say that it, had no real impact on their life, and that, they still are torn up by the loss. Like, that's just the way of it. I'm reluctant to, say that there's one way that people should feel about this, because it's a very subjective thing. I would at least propose that because we are conditioned to believe that prison is the only prescription to right or wrong, that most people just default to assuming, that will help. But yeah, it's a question worth asking. It's related to the second one. Do prisons heal victims of crime? Again, not really. It may make someone feel better because they get that vengeance, which is a very primal human urge. But it doesn't correct the wrong. Restitution seems to go a lot further in many cases. That's something that we see a lot more in, say, the corporate world, actually, where someone is wronged. Let's see. Would the person who just lost someone they loved be okay with seeing the person out and being free and not losing any of their liberties, as it did not matter if they took a life? Right. One thing that has, been batted around is the idea of putting someone into kind of more of a residential block where they are isolated from society until they can be found to be safe, but where they can actually receive meaningful counseling and a meaningful quality of life. I don't know that, I agree. It would be very jarring just to have that just completely ignored. And this isn't about suggesting that crimes should just be ignored. It's more saying this 19-year-old kid, and I'm speaking specifically to the author of the article, was party to the murder of a shop owner at the age of 19. Now, does putting him behind bars for 20 some odd years, is that a useful correction to the behavior? And does it actually help mitigate the loss of those who, suffered that? Or are there other ways that could be done? It's more about imagining a better way of repaying a debt to society that is more mutually beneficial than what we're doing today. Do prisons address the root causes of crime-generative factors of working-class black people, brown people, indigenous people, Asian Pacific Islander people, and poor whites? Crime-generative factors are what, those things that I keep referring to that drive people to that desperation where they feel the need to steal, which can lead to, violent action, or where they are so impoverished and just completely disillusioned with life that they end up, succumbing to drug addiction or what have you, which has been criminalized, therefore leads down that sort of path. And prisons, by their nature, are a reactive punishment. They are not a proactive attempt to keep people out of criminality in the first place. So it's a useful question to ask. For example, in kind of in the question that Vorfinia brings up, a potentially more useful application of resources would be in uplifting a community such that that murder never actually happens in the first place. Now, obviously, you can't stop all, criminality from happening across the board. Some things will happen. But, it's a useful question to ask. Is this just putting more and more people in a box actually helping communities get out of a cycle of criminality? And I, at this point, I'm convinced that it is not, and that we can do better. And last question. What is the debt that society has to pay to people like Marlon and his co-defendants? That's, that's a very strange question at a glance. So, the question is always asked, what is the debt to society that a criminal must pay? But if you just take a criminal and you throw them in a box and you give them nothing, you basically set them up to fail the moment they're free again. And it is a very unpopular question to ask. What is the debt that society should pay to criminals as well? But the framing of the question is basically flirting with the same thing as the root causes of crime. It's saying, this is an individual who society has ultimately failed, which is why they've fallen into criminal behavior. What can be done to address that and heal them as a person so that they stop it? It's at least worth asking, even if you're not on board with that line of thinking yet. It's a question that's worth at least kind of putting in the back of your mind, I think.
What is this place?
This last one. What is the debt that society has to pay to people like Marlon and his co-defendants? Yeah. Marlon is an individual who was party to a burglary gone wrong, which resulted in someone getting killed.
What is this place?
Paper. They have had sometimes.
Yeah, some do have. Yeah, some do allow some degree of classes and such in prison. That's true.
Oh.
And yeah, and even college. Yeah.
I mean, that's society.
There are sometimes options, yes. But yeah,
Hollywood. Wait, what?
yes, in Hollywood movies, their prisons are definitely portrayed as generally kind and just institutions, except the cases where they're not, and dramatized up. But yeah. While those things are true, while, you know, they do have some degree of classes, etc., like, let's say that they do get a degree in college, there's still, they get out, and then what? They have no savings, they have no basis to develop savings, they can't really afford a place to stay because they have nothing. They can
Probably go to a house.
Yeah, they can work through a halfway house, and sometimes that works, and very often it doesn't. Yes, your niece did. I'm just saying very often it does not. But yeah, they're questions to ask. That's all. So, continuing through this. During the 3 years that my co-defendants and I went back and forth to court without bail, praying for an Anna Keating to free us, no one but the district attorneys and the NYPD, default co-conspirators of a violent system, were allowed suggestions for our accountability. My attorney, a fidgety black man from Compton, relayed their options of justice to me. First, it was 40 years. Then 35 years to life, then 15, then up to 25, then 12 years. None of the aforementioned questions were asked in court during my legal visits from my attorney, and not once during the 10 years I eventually served. No one asked about my healing, only punishment. And it's not just his healing, it's also the healing of the people who were wronged. Now, I have already accepted the standard of accountability offered to me. I served my time. My co-defendants are serving their time, 50 years and 45 years. The keys to their cells have been thrown away. Keys I hope to help recover one day. Is society better for it? Have we solved the reasons for their unhappiness as 20-year-olds who shot up a cafe? What will 50 years of incarceration prove, other than that vengeance is the preferred elixir of justice? Have you fixed me? And again, these are uncomfortable questions, and they are coming from someone who is guilty of felony murder. But they are important questions to ask. He put in 10 years in prison. By his account, it didn't actually help. It didn't address any of his misery as a person. And here he's going to go on to talk about what did actually help him move beyond what he was as a person. And keep these things in mind, because this type of action, this type of treatment of a human being, is what actually can rehabilitate a criminal and prevent them from continuing down that path of criminal life. Conversely, I have never given prison credit for who I am today. Educators like Dr. Larry Mamiya and Dr. Nadia Lopez have been sources of happiness and healing for me. People have supported me in growing beyond the trauma of my youth. Not prison, and not the police. Through people like them, I have been able to realize that abolition is more than closing prisons and ending policing as we know it. It is about the everyday questioning and creation of solutions to the reasons why people are harmed by the few in power who have created policies like redlining and the war on drugs so the police could bother me. It is about closing the prisons and defunding the police. It is mainstreaming and resourcing the imagination of working class and poor black, brown, indigenous, and white people to create community options that value our happiness. Those in prisons, jails, and immigrant detention centers, and those walking the streets with and without ankle bracelets. Gun violence is the visible display of underlying trauma. No baby is born wanting to kill another baby. At some point, it is taught by its experiences that harming another is a viable option. I want us to commit to politics that pushes us to believe that a country that is the world's largest jailer, a world leader in firearm-related deaths, is wholly unhealthy and is in need of a remedy that prioritizes creating a society not defined by guns, prisons, and police. If a few privileged white people can conjure up an incarceration nation, then let the mass of working class and poor brown, black, indigenous, and white people create a new idea of a nation, one that can lead the world in policies of happiness for many and not just the few. Abolition must be accepted as a realistic option in the realm of justice if we are to believe in the possibilities of humans to be better than they were yesterday. Vegas is in Australia, the world's largest jail. It may have been at one time, but is no longer. Yeah. So yeah, actually receiving, after he got free, receiving counseling, one-on-one, education on things, being given emotional health therapy, some degree of safety. These things helped him. The 10 years in prison, from at least Marlon's admission and account, didn't actually do anything to set him straight. It was just 10 years of his life that were lost. And, you may still be a believer that that is just and is the best that can be expected, but it's at least worth questioning, I think.
What did he say?
What he said was let's see. There were educators like Dr. Larry Memia and Dr. Nadia Lopez who supported him in growing beyond the trauma of his youth. He received, he apparently fell in with a community that was actually supportive of him and helped lift him up out of the situation he was in. Helped get him both counseling and education and, teach him, more about how to function in and, help his own community and be, at this point he's been living as an activist for various causes. And yeah, his is definitely an exceptional story. Not everyone who gets out of the prison system does receive that sort of support from a community. Many are just left to figure it out, or, left to do it through a halfway house, and some are able to soldier on, some are not. Some have a family that will help them, some don't. But his fundamental point is that the 10 years in prison didn't do anything. It didn't actually remedy anything for the people who were harmed, and it didn't help him. It was just 10 years lost. And that is something to think about. There are some hints of things, as Varpania was alluding to, but they're not very well developed at all, especially in comparison to other nations such as Norway, who their prisoners largely lead relatively normal lives, albeit separated from broader society, but they aren't living a prison life. They are given a lot of support, and the goal is to get them to a point where they can step out and, where they can even apply for jobs and such while they're there, when they're closer to their release date. And they get the support in finding those connections and getting whatever skills they need, and not just educational skills, but also socialization with people, healthy socialization that's moderated and has therapists and such on hand. So yeah, it's it's an interesting account, and it does ask some questions that are very uncomfortable, unusual, if you have internalized the current state of policing as just the default. And I think they're very good questions to provoke, questioning if that is the only way that things can be done. I'm obviously someone who thinks that we can do better, but I think posing those questions is an important framing to get other people thinking about it. So, thank you, Marlon, for your essay, Who is Being Healed?